Odalys Freeman's landlord found the unharvested corn strip in November, 3 weeks after harvest should have been finished, and called her that same evening asking if her combine had broken down. "Nothing's broken," Odalys said. "I left it standing on purpose." There was a long pause on the line before Grantham Osei spoke again. "You understand what this fall was supposed to be for you," he said. It wasn't a question.
I know, I'm doing the best I can.
Odalys understood exactly what that fall was supposed to be. She rented 400 acres of wheat and corn ground outside a small town in central North Dakota from Grantham, a retired farmer who'd worked the land himself for 35 years before his knees gave out, and he'd started leasing it to younger operators on year-to-year cash rent agreements. She'd come to the ground 3 years earlier after a smaller rental arrangement 2 counties over fell through when that landowner's son decided to farm the ground himself, leaving her scrambling that same spring for anywhere with enough acreage to justify keeping her equipment rather than selling it off and going to work for someone else's operation. Grantham's ground had been available mostly because the tenant before her had retired outright, and she'd signed the first year's lease grateful simply to have 400 acres under her instead of nothing, without much room to negotiate terms from a landlord who had, she later learned, 2 other interested farmers waiting in case she didn't work out. She was 29, in her 3rd year on the ground, and this past September, walking the property with her before harvest, Grantham had told her plainly that this was the year that decided things. Her first 2 seasons had come in inconsistent enough, a strong wheat crop one year undercut by a weak one the next, both on the same acreage with roughly the same annual rainfall, that he'd started quietly asking around about other tenants, a fact he hadn't hidden from her so much as mentioned once, almost in passing, the way a man mentions something he once heard without having to say it as a threat outright. One of the 2 farmers who'd wanted the ground originally, a man named Kurt Haverson running a larger, better capitalized operation 2 townships over, had apparently mentioned to Grantham at a farm show that spring that he'd still take the acreage if it ever came open again, an offer Grantham repeated to Odalys almost as an aside, the kind of detail that didn't need explaining twice. If this fall's numbers didn't come in solid and dependable, he told her, he'd likely lease the ground to someone else the following spring, someone with a longer track record and less inclination to try things his own 35 years of farming that dirt had never once suggested to him. So when he found 12 acres of corn standing untouched in November, on the exact season he'd told her would determine whether she farmed that ground again, the phone call wasn't really about a broken combine. It was about whether Odalys had just thrown away the 1 year she couldn't afford to gamble with, on ground another farmer was already prepared to take off her hands the moment Grantham gave the word. What she was proposing, once she got him to actually listen past his first reaction, was something she'd read about in a Natural Resources Conservation Service bulletin on snow management for dryland wheat, leaving narrow strips of standing corn, uncut through the harvest season, spaced at intervals across an otherwise harvested field specifically to catch blowing snow. Standing corn stalks, 6 or 7 feet tall and dense enough to slow wind speed right at ground level, could trap several times more snow directly around the strip than open, harvested ground ever held onto. Snow that would otherwise simply keep moving across the flat, wind-scoured fields until it piled up uselessly in a fence line or a ditch miles from where it fell. Come spring, that trapped snow melted in place and soaked directly into the soil beneath and around the strip, adding meaningful early-season moisture to ground that, on a typical Dakota winter, often lost most of its snowfall to wind before it ever had the chance to melt where it landed. It was, she believed, the actual answer to the very inconsistency Grantham had been measuring her against for 2 straight years. Not bad farming, but uneven moisture year to year on ground that had no way to hold onto the one resource, winter snow, that could have evened it out. Grantham wasn't interested in the mechanism so much as the number attached to it and the timing. "You left 12 acres of corn standing in the 1 year I told you mattered," he said, walking the strip with his hands jammed in his coat pockets against the wind. "That's not free. That's 12 acres of corn you're not selling, on top of whatever that ground cost me in cash, rent this year regardless of what you do with it. And I've got a decision to make about this lease inside 4 months. Kurt Haverson isn't going to wait around forever if I tell him I'm still deciding. It's 12 acres out of 400, Odalys said, hearing how thin that sounded even as she said it. And it's not gone. I can still harvest it in spring once it's done its job, late as that'll be. It's delayed income, not lost income. And it's the reason next year's wheat won't swing the way the last 2 years did. You're asking me to renew a lease based on a technique I've never seen work, on ground I've farmed longer than you've been alive, Grantham said. Nobody I ever knew left a strip standing through a make-or-break winter on purpose. He didn't cancel the lease outright that day, but he made the terms of the wait explicit in a way he hadn't before. He'd hold his decision until he saw what the spring wheat crop actually did, strip or no strip. And if the numbers didn't clearly justify what she'd done, the ground would go to Kurt the following year regardless of how sound her explanation had sounded standing in a cut cornfield in November. Odalys drove home that evening having gambled, without fully meaning to, not just a season's corn income, but the entire tenancy on 12 acres of standing stalks, and a bulletin from an agency 3 states away that had never farmed a single acre of Grantham Osei's actual ground, against a competitor who was, as far as she knew, simply waiting by the phone. She spent that first winter checking the strip every couple of weeks, driving out even on days cold enough that she didn't strictly need to, mostly because she needed to actually see whether the bulletin's claims held up on this specific ground before spring arrived, and either saved or ended her tenancy on its own timeline. She started a small photo log on her phone that December, the same spot along the strip photographed from the same angle every visit, partly to track the drift's depth, and partly because she wanted a record to show Grantham if it came to arguing her case one more time before his deadline. By January, the drift along the standing corn strip had built to nearly 4 feet deep in places, a visible ridge of snow running the length of the 12 acres, while the harvested wheat ground on either side stayed largely bare, wind scoured down to exposed, frozen soil after every storm swept whatever had fallen there off toward the section line. She sent a few of the photos to Grantham that month without much comment attached, unsure whether he even looked at them, unwilling to call and ask. Her first real problem showed up in February, during a stretch of unusually warm days that partially melted the drift, refroze overnight, and left a hard ice layer capping the snowpack along roughly a third of the strip's length. When the real spring thaw came in late March, that ice layer meant meltwater ran off the top of the frozen cap, rather than soaking into the ground beneath it, the way the rest of the strip's more powdery, unfrozen snow did, essentially wasting a third of the strip's captured moisture to surface runoff instead of letting it infiltrate where it fell. Standing at the edge of that iced-over section in late March, watching meltwater sheet off toward the ditch instead of soaking in, with a lease decision now measured in weeks rather than months, Odalys did the math on how much of her 12 sacrificed acres of corn income had actually converted into usable soil moisture rather than simply having demonstrated, expensively, and on the one season that counted, that the technique could fail in ways the bulletin hadn't mentioned. For the first time since she'd cut the strip, she let herself imagine packing up the operation the following spring, explaining to whoever asked that she'd bet her tenancy on an experiment and lost it on a technicality of Dakota, whether nobody could have fully predicted. She called the county's NRCS conservation planner, a woman named Dolores Vang who'd worked with snow management techniques on a handful of other Dakota operations, and described what had happened, not bothering to hide the urgency in her voice. Dolores told her the midwinter thorofreeze cycle was a known failure mode for snow catch strips on ground, with any kind of south-facing exposure or wind pattern that concentrated sun on part of the drift more than the rest, and that the fix wasn't a different crop or a different spacing, but running the strip along a different orientation the following year, angled to minimize the specific afternoon sun exposure that had caused the partial meltfreeze on that one section, based on the property's actual slope and aspect, rather than simply running strips in the same direction as the rest of the fields rose out of habit. It was useful information. It also wasn't information
It's about
Odalys
42
could act
inches.
on before Grantham's
And it is still
decision
falling
came due that
fast.
spring. The fix belonged to next year, and next year depended entirely on convincing him there'd be a next year at all. She harvested the delayed corn from the strip itself in April, once the ground firmed up enough to get equipment in. A late, awkward harvest that cost her time and yielded corn kernels the deer and pheasants had picked over more than she'd have liked, but a harvest nonetheless. The real evidence, though, was in the wheat. Planted that spring in the ground immediately downwind of the strip, it came up visibly ahead of the rest of the field through a dry stretch in May that left much of the open ground pale and stressed, while the strip-adjacent rows stayed a deeper, steadier green, moisture readings taken at points along the old strip, and at matched points in the open, harvested ground nearby, showing a difference large enough that Odalys almost didn't trust her own probe the first time she checked it. Grantham walked the field with her that June, the month his own self-imposed deadline for a decision had arrived, looking at the difference in wheat color running out from the strip's old location. A band of deeper green fading gradually into the paler open ground, the further you got from where the snow had drifted the previous winter. He didn't say anything for a long moment, standing at the edge of the green band, with his hands back in his coat pockets out of habit, even though the June air didn't call for it. 12 acres of late picked-over corn, he said finally, for that. 12 acres of late corn, Odalys said, and the best wheat stand on this farm in the 3 years I've rented it, on a spring that was drier than the 2 before it. And a reason the last 2 years swung the way they did, if you want it. Grantham didn't answer her right away. He walked the length of the green band once more on his own, then back, before he finally spoke. I told Kurt Haverson last week I'd have an answer for him by July, he said. I meant it when I told you this was the year that decided things. I didn't expect it to get decided by a strip of corn I nearly had you plow under in November. He renewed her lease that fall on a 3-year term instead of the usual year-to-year, the first multi-year agreement he'd offered any tenant on that ground, telling her, when she finally asked why outright, that he wasn't in the business of funding somebody else's experiment on a lease he could cancel with 3 months' notice before the experiment finished proving itself. But he also wasn't in the business of running off a tenant who just handed him the most consistent wheat stand that ground had produced in years to give it to a farmer who'd never once set foot on it. He never mentioned Kurt Haverson to her again after that phone call. The following winter, at Odalys's suggestion, Grantham let her expand the technique to a second field he still farmed himself on a smaller parcel nearby, curious enough by then to want the data on his own ground rather than just hers. He oriented the new strips himself, using Dolores's aspect calculations rather than guessing, and stood at the fence that January watching the drift build the same way it had on Odalys's rented ground 2 winters earlier. Odalys still keeps the December photo log on her phone, the same angle, the same fence post, 3 winters deep now. If this channel matters to you, subscribe now and share this with every farmer you know.